Hello. Turn down the lights and get comfy. 6 true, spooky stories are about to begin. If you like calm, creepy nights, please subscribe and tap the bell so you never miss one. Stay to the end, the last part stays with you. Story number 1. On the printed timetables, the branch line was just a thin gray thread that curled into the hills, a route no one took unless there was no other choice. Most freight had been diverted years ago, and the local passengers preferred buses that came when they said they would. When a spring storm bit the side of the ridge and pushed a section of earth down toward the creek, the line was closed in a hurry. The rails hung like a forgotten necklace across the break, and a temporary fence clicked shut with a padlock that looked new and embarrassed. For a week, a security contractor sent a single guard to keep watch on the crossing and the small signal shed beside it. The guard was a quiet person named Ellis who liked schedules and thermoses and the clean certainty of keys. He walked out to the shed on the first night with a flashlight, and that soft, anticipatory feeling of being alone with a job that no one would measure until the morning. The shed was square and metal-sided, a place built to hold blinking lights and not much else. Inside, a little space heater hummed at a respectful volume. A metal stool stood under a window, and there was a desk with a narrow drawer and a hardwired phone painted the color of mayonnaise. Ellis checked the perimeter, hung his jacket, set the thermos down, and breathed in the very faint smell of creosote that leaked from the old ties stacked in the grass beyond the fence. He did what he always did first. He found the clock and wrote his initials and the time on a clipboard left for notes. The hour was quiet and straight. The road beyond the crossing only saw a car every now and then. Around 9, a low breeze started to move through the treetops, carrying the sort of distant smells he had grown up with: wet bark, spring dirt, a hint of iron. 9:47 arrived with a sound so modest that he did not put a name to it for a full 10 minutes. It began almost like a thought, like the suggestion of something that had not quite decided to be heard. He became aware that the soles of his boots were receiving a fine, rhythmic tremble from the floor. The heater hummed, the clock ticked, and under all that, as if beneath the floorboards of the night, there was a steady, purling thrum. He stood, turned off the heater, and then the clock ticked alone. He put his palm to the metal wall. The wall was cool, and the tiny shiver against his bones rose and fell with a cadence that seemed too neat to be wind. He stepped outside and pointed his flashlight toward the severed rails. From the crossing to the break, the rails lay true, dark silver on dark gravel, disappearing where the hillside had given way like a cake with a missing slice. The beam caught a light fog rising from the creek below. The crossing arms, unplugged and zip-tied upright, were still. Night insects made their small percussion, and far off, a dog barked twice in a way that sounded like it had remembered something. The ground under his boot heels did something that ground was not supposed to do. It began to hum as if it were holding a string someone had just plucked. When the desk phone rang, the sound was not an old telephone clatter or a digital chime. It was somewhere in between, a tone that was precise but softened as if filtered through fabric. He picked up the receiver and heard, very clearly, a voice say, "Briar Gate, this is South Dispatch. Confirm you're clear." The voice carried an accent from no particular place, the kind taught by work. "This is the crossing by mile 34, he said, trying to be useful. "Line closed. Break at 34.6. No movement authorized." A pause, then a repeat, exactly, as if the other end had not heard him at all. "Briar Gate, this is South Dispatch. Confirm you're clear." He set the receiver down to make it stop. The phone did not ring again. The hum underfoot settled out like a thought that had drifted away. He put the heater back on and wrote a note on the clipboard: 9:47 slight vibration. Phone call aware that it sounded like nothing happening to anyone else. He thought of going out to the fence to listen, imagined the empty dark beyond, and decided to sit. The morning supervisor came out in a truck before dawn, sipped coffee from a paper cup, and signed a line beneath Ellis's. No one mentioned phone calls that would not connect to any present network. The supervisor was the sort who carried worry in his shoulders. He looked at the break and swore expressively but not unkindly at geology. 2 more nights, maybe 3, he said, until the crews can get heavy equipment in. On the second night, the sky held itself like water just shy of boiling. Ellis arrived early, touched the padlock out of habit, and put his thermos down with a sigh that was almost comfortable. He found himself listening in advance, bracing for something he could not justify. 9:47 was a soft thud of a minute, and when it came, He knew it even before the clock confirmed it, because the world aligned on some plane that had more to do with timing than with place. The tremble rose and fell again, steadier, like a song recognized. The heater went off, the room got quiet, and the phone did not ring this time. Instead, the crossing arms chain lifted twice against its brace, with a glint he would have sworn was purposeful. He stepped outside with his light. The beam reached the rails, caught the shiny top of the head and the dark side stained with years. He noticed something he had not seen before, a chalk mark on the tie nearest the signal post, a small X, neat and white, as if someone had reached through time with a carpenter's hand. The shed had a drawer that had seemed empty the night before, and was not empty now. He found a logbook, the color of burned sugar, its cover impressed with the outline of a company name that had changed 3 iterations ago. The binding leaned. Inside were dated entries written by different hands across a quarter century. Most of them were as dull and solid as fence posts, routine checks, battery swaps, notes about timers and bulbs. One page had been dog-eared twice. On it, the handwriting was tidy, confident, and belonged to someone who had used pens all their life. 9:47. Hum. It read. Repeated X3. Phone confirms, but no one there. Below, another hand had written, not wind. It has a pattern. Farther down, a line that caught him at the back of the neck. To whoever's here when it's bad, stay off the ballast at the cut. It feels wrong when it passes. He looked up at the wall clock. He had lost 10 minutes to the page. The hum dipped and rose, as if it had been waiting politely for him to return. He went to the doorway and stood with both hands on the frame. The air outside had become very fortunate with fog. It shifted in steady folds over the rails, sliding east to west like breath exhaled by something very patient. He shone the light along the line, then cut the beam and let his eyes adjust. There, far down where the rails straightened, a small glow appeared as if someone had lifted a lantern and kept it low. It did not move so much as grow, gathering brightness without advancing. It resolved into an oval, pale as old milk, level with where a headlight might be if a locomotive were idling very softly on tracks that were, at that distance, perfectly intact. Ellis felt the useful muscles in his legs tense, and then refused to step forward. He did not think of ghosts. He thought of stupid explanations, of someone playing a joke with an ATV though, who would, and how, with the line closed, the access roads locked, and the grade broken. He thought of his radio and did not pick it up. He thought of his jacket and did not put it on. The oval light went gently out. The air kept moving, as if someone had passed through, and was careful not to disturb anything that did not belong to them. In the morning, he stopped at a diner for eggs and asked a question he'd been brought up not to ask, because it sounded like an invitation. He did not use the word haunted. He said, "That line, there was an accident there. Before, wasn't there?" The waitress had the kind of practiced kindness that does not commit to stories. She put coffee on the table and folded a sugar packet once, then again. "There was a washout," she said. "Back when my mother was young. Everyone talks about a curve. My uncle said they changed the timetable after that so people wouldn't crowd around the crossing to look for, well, you know how people are. You've got some of that look on you now." She smiled like rain on a windshield. "You be careful not to invite anything. It's just a road, just rails." He told himself she was right. By the third night, the air had taken on the worn coin smell of damp metal. He lined up 3 coins on the windowsill of the shed not because it mattered, but because it gave his hands something to do besides feel the doorframe for a pulse. He had slept poorly, the kind of sleep that misplaces time. He wrote the time again, his initials again, and took a breath and stood very still. 9:47 came on like a machine sliding into gear. The heater was already off. The clock seemed louder. The tremor, if that was what it was almost gentle. He placed 1 coin on the railhead outside, where the beam could find it again later. The coin was an old state quarter with an eagle that had spent years in pockets that had kept it normal. He put it there as a test he could dismiss in the Pousand. Morning, whether or not anything had moved. He stood back and watched the fog move. Somewhere in it, the small oval pail that was not a headlamp grew, and then diminished as if someone were working a dimmer with patience. He did not blink for too long. He did not step onto the ballast. The hum rose. It was metronomic, matched to old clocks and old beating hearts. He held his breath and felt it move through him, not quite sound, not quite vibration, something that reminded him of being a child and standing too close to where a train passed and feeling it travel up his arm, gentle, insistent, not asking permission. When it passed, the fog rippled once like a curtain brushed by a hand. The coins on the sill chattered by a millimeter. His quarter remained on the head of the rail, and then wasn't there. He looked down into the dark where the gravel dropped toward the creek, and saw nothing but brush and the suggestion of water. He did not go looking. He would, he told himself, find it in the morning sunk between two ties, and he would of course not. He took the logbook out of the drawer and wrote it down without telling the page he expected anyone to believe him. He underlined the time, and when the hum came again, very slightly, a few minutes later, like a far studio laying down a second track, he looked at the margin of the page and saw, where no words had been, a faint impression that could have been there for years, waiting to be noticed. It read in the shallow language of an older pen, "You felt it too." On the fourth evening, wind came off the ravine with a colder edge, and branches tilted and held their positions as if they were watching a game. The radio on the desk lifted a quiet voice that did not belong to any of the usual channels. It used numbers in an order Ellis did not recognize, codes to do with siding and block limits for a system that had been replaced before he was born. He stood with one hand on the set, willing the voice to belong to a towner somewhere, playing with a shortwave, even as he knew he didn't know anyone who would. The voice named the line. It named the crossing the way a person names a street they used to live on. It spoke the milepost numbers that matched the chalked X's he had noticed in daylight that now felt like notes left in plain sight. Then it stopped, having said enough, and the radio was only a rectangular object again. That night, the light returned and, for the first time, seemed to advance an illusion, he told himself, of fog and waiting eyes. It grew and grew until the shed's thin window glass felt warmer, and then cooler as if air had been displaced. The padlock chain tapped twice, the way a metal object does when brushed by something that has weight and velocity and the right to be there. He found himself looking at the brake with what could only be called hope, that whatever approached would stop on the near side as common sense required, and then felt the sensation that untaught his hope. The hum peaked in a tone that did not hurt ears. The fog pressed down over the cut, and for the length of a breath and another, Ellis felt his shirt press into his chest, as if the whole hillside had exhaled. He held the doorframe very slightly tighter. He thought of hands on his shoulder and teeth and other hard things, and pushed those thoughts away because they were not true here. When it had passed, the silence stepped back in like a friend arriving to see what had happened. Ellis slept in the daylight after that with the radio on so he would not dream. He dreamed anyway clean, non-flashy dreams about walking the tracks in shoes that left no prints. He saw trees that were not quite the trees he knew, and a sky with fewer stars and a hand, gentle and work rough, resting on a ledger he could almost read. On the fifth night, the supervisor's truck sat at the end of the access road with the hood up. No one was inside. Ellis walked around it and told himself the problem was a battery. The shed felt more crowded when he opened the door, as if he had arrived late to a conversation and everyone inside had turned to look without having faces. He took the logbook and did not open it. He took out his own small pocket notebook and wrote his name in it deliberately. He folded the paper and put it in the inner pocket of his jacket, a gesture that felt, without needing sense, like keeping a promise to someone he had not met. 9:47 approached like a train does at a pedestrian crossing, when the guard has not come down yet, a feeling of arithmetic and inevitability. The hum began before the minute did, and the radio warmed, and the coins he had placed on the sill clicked to attention. The heater was off, the clock had been wound out of habit, and the fog slid over everything like paper under a hand. He stood at the door and, for the first time, took one step onto the gravel and stopped himself. The ballistic memory of the line, the stories of people in diners who didn't tell stories, the notes written in careful old ink, all rose like a boundary that was still visible in the air. He put his hand on the railhead and felt the faint warmth of something that should have been just a piece of carbon steel cooling with night. A light appeared where it had appeared before and did not pretend to be anything else. It swelled, and with it came a sequence of hollow knocks traveling under the ground. They spaced themselves evenly, like a wheel crossing joints in a rail. Ellis bent his head, because that is what bodies do when something bigger is passing. He waited for sound that would fill the lungs, and did not come. Instead, There was pressure, and the faintest smell of oil and ozone, and a sense that if one listened past one's heartbeat, names could be heard. Or maybe they were numbers, repeated in sets of 3, like mile markers called off by someone who needed to believe in anchors. The break in the earth took the fog in and gave it back. The pressure eased, the glow faded. The radio whispered a code that belonged to no one now. When Ellis went back inside, he saw that the logbook lay open, though he had not opened it, to a page whose date did not match the calendar. The neat hand was there again. "Do not stand on the ballast at the cut," it had said, and below, in a new line that had not been there, "Thank you for not stepping." The ink was the sort that dries quickly, and looks like it has always been where it is. He put his palm to the page and felt the faintest residual warmth, no more than the warmth of paper that has spent a moment under a cautious hand. The cruise came the following week with machines that were loud in a way that made the valley look different. The track was cut back. The rails were stacked with straps around them. The break was measured and described in numbers and cones and nodded at by people wearing vests who believed in fixing. The shed was emptied and left locked and quiet, and then unlocked again, and then taken away entirely one afternoon while Ellis was somewhere else. He signed a final line on a different clipboard handed to him by someone who smiled without looking at him, and the padlock, which had always looked new and embarrassed, hung on an empty chain like a punctuation mark with nothing to do. Months later, a friend of a friend sent him a set of old photocopied pages in a manila envelope with no return name. They were from a company circular that had been pinned in break rooms in the 70s. "Effective immediately," it said. "Briargate overnight crossing operations are suspended to discourage gathering." Below, a typed note in the clipped language of memos explained that certain irregular reports of flashing and foot traffic during hours of darkness had invited attention, and it would be best not to invite. Ellis put the pages in a drawer and closed it, and, after a moment, opened it again and placed the photocopies beneath his own small notebook, where he had written his name on a folded sheet the night he almost stepped. Later, at home, his kitchen clock stopped each night for a week at 9:47, and then, just as quietly, did not do that anymore. He changed the battery because that was a thing to do with clocks. In town, people spoke of the line in present tense for a while longer than was reasonable. They said things like, "You'll want to take the river road," "The rail's uncertain since the slide," as if the line had any intention at all. The diner put out a little card next to the register asking people to support the rebuild because it felt like the sort of thing that deserved supporting. On an afternoon when the sun cut cleanly through after 3 days of rain, Ellis parked by the river and walked a parallel path beside where the rails had been. He saw a white chalk X, more faint now, on the tie that had once aligned with the old signal post. He did not touch it. He put his hand on the air above it as if feeling for a pulse, and felt nothing but air and the weight of his own hand, and maybe the kindly sense that somewhere, something recorded that he had been kind in return. He never found the quarter. He kept telling himself he would, and then he stopped telling himself anything at all about it. Years later, he could still hear, sometimes in hotel rooms where the fridge thumped and the ice machine delivered its hollow choir, that small, polite hum that felt like a train passing through a place it had memorized. He did not think of it as a haunting. He thought of it as a habit the land had not yet broken. If anyone asked, he would say the line had been closed after a washout, the hill had held, and the company had moved on. He would not mention the phone with its mayonnaise paint, or the way a padlock rattled twice when something no one could see made room for itself to get through. On a winter morning with a sky like glass and frost-like disclosures on the grass, he woke to the sound of a truck reversing on the road, and realized it was just a truck. He made coffee and watched the steam rise and break apart over the cup. He thought of the shed and the ledger and the hands that had left a warning in the neat shape of a sentence. In some file somewhere, there were notes and memos and the names of people who had written them, each of them thinking they were being practical. On some stretch of cleared hillside, there was a place where fog still liked to gather more than anywhere else. And in a drawer in an apartment that otherwise did not invite stories, there was a folded page with his name and a date that marked the night he held onto a doorframe and stood politely aside for something that had the right of way. Story number 2. The old municipal library had announced its closure for renovation with a pressed, cheerful banner and a letter-perfect press release, and the building received these plans the way a patient receives a new schedule of medication quietly, with a long look at the ceiling. By winter, The grand reading room was empty of patrons. Chairs were stacked on tables. The rare books were sealed in climate-tight crates. The card catalog stood like a sleeping orchard. Drawers pushed in for the first time anyone could remember. A small team rotated through night watch to keep the air steady and to log what the building did when no one was meant to be there. Mara took 2 nights a week because she liked the quiet and the way sound, when it did occur, traveled cleanly from one side of the room to the other without getting lost in conversation. She liked paper that had been touched by careful hands. She liked the way the building announced itself through smells: varnish, cotton, old glue, citrus from a cleaner that had gone out of style 30 years ago but never truly left. Her job was to monitor the climate control set points, move carts from one zone to the next at a measured pace, and make notes if anything required attention in the morning. The first night, she checked the thermostats, signed the log, and walked the barred balcony that circled the high room. Outside the windows, the late city pressed against the glass with the soft presence of low clouds reflecting streetlight. The desk bell, a brass dome worn shiny at one edge, sat where it had always Saturday. There were no patrons to summon anyone. Yet, at 12:31 by the wall clock, the bell rang once on its own, not an alarmed ring, just the light, exact sound of a finger pressing and lifting. It rang the way a memory arrives, particular and without any obvious reason. She stood very still and waited until the echoes lay down. Then she went to the main desk, because the habit was too strong not to. On the desk sat nothing except the blotter, the pencil cup, and a single hardbound ledger she did not remember from earlier. It had a cloth cover the color of old snow and no title. Inside, the first page said, in handsome faded ink, "Quiet hours log, staff use." The dates began in the 1,950 seconds and ran forward in different hands. Entries were short, practical. Noise from northeast vent, adjusted. Small draft by map room door, will tape tomorrow. Bell rang at 12:30. 1 a.m. No one present. Chalk mark at seat 14 cleared. The notemaker had not underlined anything, but the time repeated across decades settled in Mara's mind like a blue bead. She did not touch the bell again. She walked past the old pneumatic tube canister bolted against the wall behind the desk, long since retired and disconnected supposedly. The metal cylinder was the sort of fixture people forgot to remove. Its glass window still showed a little paper sleeve where call slips had once slotted in. A minute later, a rush of air sighed through the dead network, soft and polite, as if the building were adjusting itself. The tube, which should have been nothing but a sealed bone, coughed. Inside the glass, a slip of paper slid down and came to rest in the sleeve. She stared at it for a long time, not because it was frightening, but because it was so precise about disobeying the present. She lifted the window and pinched the slip between 2 fingers. The paper was crisp, the way catalog cards are crisp when they've been kept out of light. Written in a library hand that could have belonged to any year from 1935 to 1970, was a simple request. Map, transit overlay, 1928. For seat 14. The chairs in the reading room were numbered in tiny brass plates only librarians notice. Seat 14 was halfway down the long table beneath a chandelier that always hummed a little. It was currently upside down on the tabletop, legs in the air like a beetle. Mara lowered it gently to the floor out of good manners. The table lamp at that seat flickered once and settled to a warm amber that maintenance had not managed to suppress when they replaced the bulbs. The room looked as it always did after hours, more itself than in daytime, uncomplicated in its purpose. She took the slip to the map room, because that is what one does with a slip. The map room held flat files labeled by decade and subject. The metal drawers slid with a sound that felt safe to her. She located the 1920 seconds transit bank and pulled out the drawer with a white-gloved hand, because that was habit too. There was a folder marked 1928, and within it, the overlay the slip wanted. Delicate tracing paper, transit lines inked in thin red, handwritten notations in a naval pencil. Someone had circled a block near the West Riverfront with a soft, exact hand. She did not check why. This was not research, it was ritual. She put the map inside a clean sleeve, placed it on a flat cart, and wheeled it to the reading room. Seat 14 waited in its pool of amber. The map sat there with a modest authority, a document that had finally gotten where it was going. Mara put the call slip under the lip of the paper and stepped back. She was not sure whether she expected anything to happen. Nothing did. The clock on the wall ticked and then breathed almost audibly at the half-minute, the way old clocks sometimes do when they are pleased with themselves. After that, on nights when Mara had the building, the pneumatic tube would politely deliver 1 or 2 slips. They never asked for anything dramatic. Atlas sheets, a city directory volume that had not been consulted in years, a ledger of building permits from a decade when everyone liked to write their initials with a flourish. She fulfilled the requests because it added structure to the watch, and because the building seemed to be using the behaviors it already understood to tell her what it wanted. The second week, a slip arrived that was less like a patron request and more like a note from staff to staff, as if the building were reaching into an in-house shorthand. Plano. District Key, it said. Check range 14, base C, shelf 3. The circulating stacks had been shut down and draped, the barcodes read and reread by a bored summer team. Still, the language made her think of wood shelving and pewter-colored brackets, and the way labels tilt after 30 years. She walked through the maze of covered aisles until she reached range 14, Bay C, shelf 3. There was no book there, only a small brass key lying neatly on the shelf with a tag stamped 7. The main desk had a wooden key case with numbered hooks that had long ago become a decorative object. Hook 7 was empty. She hung the key there by instinct and wrote in the quiet hours log, "Found tag 7, log to case." Below, where no ink had been when she first opened the book, appeared, later that night, a faint line of pencil in a hand she did not know. Good. Keep to sequence. The graphite had the look of old marks made firm again. At 12:31, the desk bell rang once. Seat 14's lamp lit without drama. The reading room was still empty of everyone except the furniture and the air. The ambient thrum of the climate system changed, almost imperceptibly, to the tone of a room holding its breath before a page is turned. Not every sign was as neat. The elevator down to the basement would arrive at the ground floor when no one had called it, open politely to an empty hallway, and close again after the time a person might take to step out. The workroom clock and cataloging would gain a minute and then give it back. The card catalog drawers would sit flush, and then, when she looked again, one would be out by the width of a pencil, revealing the narrow, perfect space in which cards had slid for generations. The building did not insist on anything. It simply demonstrated that it remembered how to be used. The old microfilm reader still worked, because a staff member with a particular affection for archive machines had kept it alive. One night, as Mara passed it, the screen was glowing a soft, respectful gray. She touched the handle without meaning to, and felt the slight grit of film threaded through the gate. The label on the reel said City Room, 1963 to 1972, which could have been almost anything. She sat in the dark and turned the crank. The image resolved into the reading room, as it used to be: different lamps, different arrangements, a bank of ferns on the south sill that would not be permitted now. She turned the crank again and watched the room breathe itself forward frame by frame. A person came into view, not clear enough to name, but clear enough to be a body with a coat that moved. The person crossed to seat 14, adjusted the lamp, paused as if listening, and Saturday, the frame did not change for several seconds. She could not have explained why she did not move. The air smelled of acetate, and a slight sweetness from decades of transparencies. When the person on the screen looked up, the image found enough focus to give the impression not of face, not eyes, but the shape of someone who could have been her if time did not care much about sleeves. She did not test that impression. She let the frame go dark again and unthreaded the reel because it was better to be kind than to be sure. The key with the brass tag became a way in. The staff door behind the circulation desk had a small lock that had not agreed to turn in years. On the third week, the key turned. The door opened on a narrow mezzanine she had never seen on any tour, a skinny walkway behind the stacks overlooking the reading room like a whisper behind a word. The shelf there held chalk and a board with a list written twice, and then erased, again and again. Call numbers, drawer names, the tidy arithmetic of moving and returning. On a small table sat a ledger like the quiet hours book downstairs, only older and less formal. It contained a single list. Missing. Drawer. 7 corridor plans. Revised. Return requested. Please do not cut through choir. Choir? The building had no choir. The word lay there like a local nickname. Mara turned and looked down into the reading room. The amber lamp at 14 burned like a patient. The bell did not ring. She took the ledger with both hands, as if it might be offended by carelessness, and carried it to the desk. It seemed right to have both books together. When she set it beside the other, the tube sighed and coughed again. The new slip was simple. Drawer 7. She went to the map room and discovered something she should have noticed weeks before. The cabinet that held corridor plans had drawers numbered consecutively, except that a space where 7 ought to be had always appeared perfectly normal to her eyes. The drawers were labeled 5, 6, 8, with no gap. Once the idea that 7 should exist had settled in her head, the cabinet looked different. There was a hairline seam where smooth metal bent into itself. She ran her gloved finger along it and felt, surprisingly, the faintest draft. The revised corridor plans mattered. In the 1,960 seconds, a renovation had buried a service passage under a floor that aligned perfectly with the reading room symmetry. Someone had sketched a correction in pencil on tracing paper, and then, apparently, failed to deliver it to wherever final decisions were made. The building kept a record, because that is what buildings do in rooms like these. The tube delivered a second slip in the same clean hand as the first. Take the long way. She wheeled a rolling ladder aside and looked at the panel from a different angle. Behind the cabinet, a false wall wore the same color of paint as the map room. She pressed at the seam and felt the give of a latch more than a lock. The brass key fit there too, not perfectly but well enough to encourage patience. The panel opened only a little, enough to permit a single hand. Inside was the shape of a flat drawer, not meant to be seen from the room. It was dustless in that way hidden things are. The label on the front edge, faded but exact, read, Corridor Plan Stage Revised Drawer 7. On the top, in the same tidy pencil as the old ledger, someone had written, Return to light when the air is right. She looked at the humidity gauge on the wall. She knew from training the safe range in which paper can breathe without buckling. The needle stood at the edge of that range. She waited. The building's air system sighed, fulfilled a cycle, and the needle moved, not dramatically, just enough. She slid the drawer out, flat and slow, and placed it on a cart. The climate felt like someone had given the room back its exact temperature. Somewhere, politely, the elevator opened and closed. Somewhere, the bell at the desk made one quiet sound. Not a ring so much as a soft ascent. The corridor plans themselves were beautiful in their limited way. Faint pencil lines overhand, drafted ink, a surveyor's stamps. On the margin, in a pencil that must have lived here, someone had written, Do not cut through the choir. Go around the stacks. She understood then. Choir meant the semicircle of wood and plaster behind the reading room's north wall. A shell of sound where a small ensemble had once been allowed to perform. The renovation had threatened to pierce it for a utility run, and someone had cared very much that it remain a circle unbroken. She placed the plan at seat 14, under the lamp that seemed designed to shine on it. She laid the call slip beside it with a paperweight so it would not wander. She put the old ledger beside the quiet hours book and signed both with her initials because that felt correct. In the old ledger, she added a line. Drawer 7 returned. It felt like writing a note to a relative who would never answer, but would be pleased to have received it. Below her note, very faintly, a second hand wrote, Thank you for respecting sequence. Shelf key with map index 7. She returned the key to the case and hung it on hook 7. The elevator stayed where elevators stay when nothing is being asked of them. The tube did not cough again. The reading room lamps did not flicker. The building, not satisfied exactly, but relieved, settled. After that night, her watches were ordinary in the way ordinary can be when it is thoughtful. She moved carts from cool to cooler. She checked that the red line on the hygrometer did not wander. She dusted the top edges of shelves one more time because dust does not love anyone. On her last shift before the moving crew arrived, the tube presented a final slip. It had no request written on it, only a single word. Closed. She placed it in the quiet hours log, where it looked like the last sentence of a chapter, rather than the end of a book. The renovation went forward with fewer surprises than anyone expected. The crews uncovered the old service passage in a place that did not injure the good roundness behind the reading room's north wall. A project manager made a speech about the value of heritage features. Someone printed a neat placard for the lobby. Our gratitude to staff whose careful attention to the archival record guided safe retrofit. And even though no one named anyone, Mara felt the phrasing land near her and looked down so as not to catch it with her face. Weeks later, in her office at the temporary facility, a plain inter-office envelope arrived with no sender. Inside was a due slip stamped in purple ink with a year decades gone. It read, Drawer 7. Returned. Fine waved. The punch at the top right corner had never been torn. If she held it up to the light, she could see the watermark the old paper supplier used. A tiny eye in a triangle that always looked benevolent. She put the slip in the front of the quiet hours log, which she had convinced the project to keep with operations rather than display, and closed the cover with her hand flat on it as if on a sleeping dog. When the building reopened to the public, the reading room was both new and old. The lamps were LED now, but they had kept the amber shade that made each pool feel like the beginning of a second paragraph. The mezzanine behind the staff door had been sealed with a carefully matched panel. The lock did not exist anymore, except in the record. Patrons returned and immediately found their old places by instinct. Seat 3 for those who liked to be near the dictionary stand. Seat 14 for someone who needed the quiet that happens where a room's voice is best. A docent, leading a small tour, mentioned, without knowing why the words mattered, that an earlier plan would have split the north wall, but a last-minute discovery preserved it. It's better for sound this way, the docent said. You can hear yourself think. Mara stood at the edge and watched the air move. She noticed a small caution taped to the wall behind the desk that read, simply, "Do not cut through the choir," and wondered who had decided to leave the mysterious language in place. She could not hear the tube anymore because there was none. But sometimes, when the desk bell was touched by a patron with a question, the sound would ring through the room at the exact timbre that meant 12:31 a.m. Most people did not know a sound could carry an hour. She went home and put her keys on the table. A flat envelope, brown paper, sat where she did not remember putting it. No sender. Inside, a photocopy from the old ledger. The page where she had written, Drawer 7 returned. The pencil note beneath. And at the top, in that tidy hand, she would have recognized anywhere by then, a line. You took the long way. She laughed, not because it was funny, but because her body needed a sound that was not the held breath of the building. She put the page in a drawer, the kind a person reaches into for stamps and spare batteries, and a pen that writes on. Receipts. Sometimes at night, in the interim apartment where her life had moved while the library changed its height by a fraction, the radiators made their steady clicks, and the hallway hummed with someone else's television. And sometimes, at 12:31, there would be a small, exact sound in her mind like a bell rung once, because that was the right number of times. She did not get up to check the door. She did not get up to check the window. She lay still and thought about maps that had spent their lives folded. She thought about drawers that pretended not to exist until it mattered. She thought of the building as a human, thought about breath, and then returned to it without effort, because the room was right, and the air was right, and everything was placed where it belonged. Story number 3. The storage facility sat at the edge of the distribution park where the highway widened and the sound of tires became a permanent weather. It was a neat grid of rows with white roll-up doors and flat numbers stenciled in black, long corridors of light under ribbed metal roofs. From the road, people saw perimeter fencing, a keypad at the gate, and a small office with a glass window where the day manager smiled at renters and slid contracts across the counter. At night, the building became a set of held breaths. The motion sensor lights clicked on only when something moved. The space between rows filled with a clean, even dark. The night manager, a person named Imani, who liked systems that made sense, learned every sound of the place by heart. The digital chirp as the gate acknowledged a code, the soft murmur from the climate control building, the tinny echo when a cart rolled too fast and checked a front wheel. Imani took the overnight shifts because it meant the world was narrow and comprehensible. There were cameras in the office that covered every row, a golf cart with a high, odd whine to its electric motor, and a binder full of routines she could have done blindfolded. Every hour, she drove the inner perimeter, and then walked the climate-controlled building to look for condensation on seams. Every 2 hours, she checked locks on the drive-up units. Her keys hung on a coiled wristband because that's what worked. The first night something tilted was midweek, after midnight, when the park was empty and the sky glowed with the sodium tint that comes from 100 acres of concrete reflecting light. It was 2:19 by the small desk clock that ran 30 seconds fast and held on to that fact like a personality. She was in the office with the monitor wall, one hand around a paper cup of coffee, eyes letting themselves rest. The motion lights along row E came on one by one, marching from the far gate inward. Pop, pop, pop. A fair, steady rhythm. The sensors weren't supposed to do that. They were isolated, triggered by their own PIR, not daisy-chained. If wind moved them, lights came on out of order, and if a cat set them off, there was no neat spacing. This had the tempo of a person walking. Imani sat forward, cup cradled in both hands. The ovals of light advanced 10 doors, paused, and then resumed. Slightly faster this time, as if someone had matched their stride to a beat, and adjusted. The cameras showed nothing but brushed concrete, aluminum doors, and a small drifting of paper near E23, the kind of corner of a packing list people tuck in their pockets and forget. She keyed the radio clip to the golf cart charger. Row E motion, she said, to a channel that was just her, because saying it made the event live somewhere besides the screen. She toggled to the camera covering the gate. The gate did not move. The keypad did not flash. Famous codes require digits. The count remained 0. The light sequence reached mid-row and then, like someone reconsidering, sidestepped into the cross aisle through which a person could cut to row F. Pop, pop, pop. Row F lights woke in a new line and ran to the far end where a yellow bollard stood. Then everything settled, and the cameras went back to their comfortable grayscale. She went out with the golf cart, the night air cold and clean in the kind way that turns breath into a small cloud. When she reached the far end of row E, she could still feel the slight warmth of recently lit bulbs. The overhead fixtures were modern, efficient, the type with a ring of LED around a sensor eye. Nothing moved. There were no fresh tire tracks, no damp footprint in a run-over puddle by E18. The paper by E23 lay in the place she had seen it on the camera. She turned it with her toe out of reflex. It was a label half torn from a box, ink washed enough that only the ghost of a word remained. She slid the coil of her keys higher on her wrist, not because of fear, but because it was something to do with a hand that had begun to live on a different timeline from the rest of her. In the morning, the day manager laughed it off with relief. "Sensor's false trigger," he said. "A moth can do it. Spiders weave right over the lens. You'd be surprised how often it happens. Or, a sudden temperature change. The building breathes." He tapped the clipboard, his own routine alive in him. "If it keeps at that hour, I'll have the electrician look." It kept at that hour. The next night, 219 returned with the manner of a phone that only rings once because it knows you are there. This time, the keypad at the gate chirped a flat denial, as if someone had entered a code that had not been used in years. The small screen did not show numbers, only a red minus. The intercom speaker stuttered, a gentle pickup of line. Imani pressed the talk button out of habit. "Northline storage," she said, voice calm, the version she used for strangers. The line responded with a breath, and what might have been a voice choosing a first word. Then nothing. The gate did not roll. The red light remained a calm, small eye. The motion lights in row E began again. Pop, 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 at a human pace. She left the office and walked without running. She knew how to move in her own space. The coil of keys tapped her sleeve. When she reached the cross aisle at E12, the line of lights was coming toward her. She stood a meter back from the edge because it seemed rude to crowd. She had the quiet, foolish thought that she did not want to be in the path of whatever tempo this was. The lights reached E14, E13, and then the one by the corner blinked, not in front of her but to her right, as if something had chosen to cut across sooner to give her room. She did not step forward. She stepped back. The lights made the turn without brushing her. Air moved in a soft, crisp way along her sleeve that could have been the pressure shift of a door closing somewhere else. The chain hanging from the pull of E19's door swayed once, and then was still. In the office, the monitor's time code ticked its even line. The column for access codes recorded a small entry at 219 that did not fit any present user, just a code number filed under vendor Archive, courier. The day manager later scrolled through the list and frowned in the way people do when their brain has to search for a file. "That's old," he said, and ran a thumb over the screen. "We used to have late-night document drop before my time. Folks would come after hours to put sealed bins in climate so they wouldn't sit in trucks. We phased that out. Nobody does courier by hand anymore." He hovered a finger over the code. "It's not active though, it shouldn't ping anything." The code pinged nothing and everything. It became a little bell inside Imani's mental calendar. At 2:19, she found herself standing near the window if she happened to be in the office, or near a cross aisle if she happened to be on a walk. There was no compulsion to be there. It just felt appropriate to be present when something that had learned to arrive became punctual. On the third night, she decided she was done with watching from in front of cameras. She took the golf cart to the far gate at 2:10 and waited. The sound of highway tires was steady. A train far across the river gave a single long tone, far enough that it might have been the river deciding to speak at last. The gate's keypad screen was a soft, neutral green. The intercom light was out. She could smell the faint damp behind the grassy strip where sprinklers had run hours earlier. At 2:19 exactly, something invisible in the gate's control box engaged. She heard it. A tiny relay click, the sound of a system doing something it had been told to do long ago. The gate's indicator remained green. The metal did not move. But above the keypad, a small, ancient thermal paper printer, one she had never seen operate, spit out an inch of paper and cut it. The strip hung there, still curled from its roll. She took it. On it, in faded black, was a line of text that only barely read as text at all. Courier E, 192. 19 inches. The printer had not been serviced in years. It also had not been removed, and so it did what it once did because that is what mechanisms like to do when they are allowed to try. She carried the strip in her jacket pocket for the rest of the night, and then slid it under a magnet on the side of the office filing cabinet nobody opened. The day manager stared, then smiled with the brisk shock of someone running into a younger version of their job. "I'll get the maintenance contractor to take that out," he said. "It'll keep spitting out bits and make us think we're in a movie. Probably got a burp of power." He was cheerful because the alternative was thought. Imani preferred the truth that systems sometimes remember themselves. Word traveled among day staff in a sideways way that does not commit anyone to belief. The groundskeeper, a man who liked hose patterns and making straight broom lines in the dust near the dumpsters, mentioned that his father had worked in the printworks that had stood on the lot before the park, back when there were small pallet trucks and a bell you could ring at a side door, and someone would take your stiff paper and give you softer paper back. "There was a dog," he said, as if to add personality to a place. "It would lie across the threshold and make you step high, and if you stepped high, you were probably cleared to be there." He was not making a suggestion. He was remembering aloud. "My father said the night crew took the long way around the presses because the floor hummed in a way that could get into your head if you cut straight through." Imani did not need a story to be ready for the humility of stepping aside. She already had learned the floor around E19 liked to keep a clear lane at 219. There, if she stood with her back to the units and her toes at the chalky line where tires never quite wore, the air softened for a breath, then steadied. The chain swayed. The motion lights did their work. They did not flash. They did not panic. They saluted and sat down. On a windy night, the kind where the sound of the fence can turn into a dozen little harps, Row E collected leaves and a drift of cardboard curls that looked like feathers pulled from a packing box. At midnight, she swept the worst of it to the side, so nothing would tumble into door rails. By 2, a fine gray dust settled in a new, even coat. At 2:19, the lights did their neat march. She stood by the cross aisle, out of the way. After the run, the dust had a path through it as slim and straight as if a narrow cart had been pulled with careful hands. No tread marks, nothing crushed, just a clean path like a line drawn by a level. She crouched and touched the edge, fingertips collecting powder. There was no oil smell, no rubber ghost. She watched her breath blur the line, and then leave it alone. The desk phone rang, the office one nobody used except for confirmation calls. A voice left a message while she was on the night walk. When she listened, it was an older man's measured tone, the kind that asks a question like a person requesting a refill after a long pause. "Unit E19, he said. Door makes a sound at night, like it's remembering being used. He gave a number. The contact on file for E19 belonged to a customer whose niece had been in last summer to clear it. Imani called the number anyway in daylight. A woman answered and said they had turned the unit over months ago. "We were done," she said. He would check it at 2 in the morning sometimes. He liked the quiet. They always knew him at the gate. Imani did not say the code printed by a dead printer. She walked row E again before sunset, counted the doors, ran her finger over the numbers stenciled at eye level, and looked at 19 as if it were a door at home. The cylinder lock was correct. The tamper tag was whole. The edges were clean. She stood back and mapped in her head the space behind it. 8 by 20 feet. Concrete slab. Wire mesh. Forming a ceiling to keep honesty honest. The air coming out from below the door smelled like 1,000 neutral objects layered together. Somewhere inside, probably near the back, there would be a pallet or two for anything that did not like direct concrete. Someone had once set down a steel hand truck. She could hear the weight in the silent space the way people who like their jobs can hear shape where others hear absence. On the 5th night, batteries in the emergency lights were scheduled to be tested by the maintenance company. The contractor had warned her there would be a short, deliberate cutover around 2 to check what came on independently. Emergency fixtures do not care about motion. They glow because they have been taught to do so when they feel alone. At 2:17, as if making room, the air handlers on the climate building wound down. The main lights went off in clean rows that felt like blinking in slow unison. The emergency lights came up. Small circles of softer light. Pools that suggested stepping stones. The monitor wall turned into a quilt of gentle greenish squares, more shadow than picture. The gate's keypad lost its gleam, and then settled into battery courtesy. At 2:19, the old rhythm came regardless of the test. Only this time, there was no series of brisk pops as fixtures woke. The line revealed itself instead as a series of small reflections in the polished edges of doors. A movement of brightness along metal that did not originate in any light. Imani's eyes adapted and found the hallway shaping a path on its own, not of lamps, but of decisions. She had propped both cross-aisle doors earlier at shoulder height with rubber wedges so no door had to complain. She stood at the near corner, not obstructing. She thought of the groundskeeper's father stepping high to avoid a sleeping dog, and of rooms that hum if you cut across the wrong place. The air cooled the skin on her hands by a degree, nothing dramatic, just like opening a freezer and then closing it carefully. Chains ticked lightly against door guides in a neat, contained percussion, then lay still. From the office, a printer that was not the little thermal one woke and offered a page with the heart of a routine. The system had been built to log events. It logged. Test. Emergency lighting pass. The page read. And beneath, because once upon a time, someone had told it to be thorough. Notes. E19 path clear. She could not have explained to anyone else why those words made it easier to swallow. Systems writing notes to themselves rarely do poetry, but the sentence felt close. What changed after that was not much. As the maintenance cutover ended and the main lights came smoothly back, the motion rings went out of their way to do nothing unusual for a quarter hour. The gate did not chirp. The intercom did not pick up breath. At 2:19 the next night, the old progression returned once more, patient as always, unhurried, favorable to a clear lane. Imani, who had by then stopped pretending she went out just for the sake of policy, stood near the back at row E's far end and watched a small triangle of paper lift and lay itself down again in a way that would have been impossible to prove. The day manager said he would have the electrician examine row E's motion line and perhaps replace the lot so everything matched and nothing held on to old behavior. He ordered a stack of new fixtures and then, without comment, delayed installation until the end of the month. People do that sometimes when a thing is working in a way that does not break. There was a Sunday in early spring when a contractor opened a panel at the rear of the property to tie in power for a new sign. The cutout revealed a slice of wall that had once been interior old paint, ghosted lettering under sheet metal. The groundskeeper called her over to see because he knew she would love a found thing. The letters, when brushed with a dry glove, revealed themselves to be a modest phrase painted in a burly hand decades ago. Night transfer E, row 19. The edges of the 5 had been retouched at some point by someone who wanted their painted sign to age with grace. Imani stood with the sun warming the back of her jacket, and read the words without saying them aloud, because naming things too loudly has a way of reducing them. She felt unreasonably fond of a painter none of them would meet. The day manager took a photo and then, without thinking, straightened the edge of a piece of peeling paint with a fingernail, the way careful people groom each other in small ways. She did not take souvenirs from her job. She kept the thermal strip from the old printer, because it felt like it belonged to the building more than to a person. She tucked it into a plain envelope marked with the date and nothing else, and slid it into the bottom drawer of the office filing cabinet, behind spare labels and old Allen keys. In the week before the electrician changed fixtures, she printed a small laminated card and taped it inside the office window, where only staff would read it. It had 2 lines. Row E, keep cross, aisles clear after 2 amperes. M, and beneath, because courtesy begets courtesy. Thank you. No one asked why those words mattered. The few who worked at night learned to keep that path straight because it felt like an easy kindness. Every so often after, when she was closing a unit for a renter who wanted to move in at first light, she would feel the small brush of air at her sleeve around that hour, and the chain on E19 would give one neat nod, as if acknowledging her presence. The cameras would record only gray and light, and the gate would remain, outwardly, a gate. Imani grew used to sleeping in daylight, to the pattern of tires, to the clean quiet of units that hold 1,000 small lives stacked in boxes with marker-written labels. Sometimes when she woke from the small necessary nap that comes at noon for those who work at night, she would think of that clear lane through dust and feel a sort of peace that came from stepping to one side and letting patterns finish themselves. Years later, after she moved on to a different building with different routines and a lobby that hummed in a new key, someone texted her a photo from the storage facility. A new painted sign with a design that felt, in its bones, familiar. It was small, brushed tastefully on the inside of the staff door. It read, "Night transfer path clear." It made her laugh quietly in an apartment where the refrigerator clicked and the heat came up through old pipes. 219 was just a time again in a world full of them. But if she happened to be awake then, she sometimes paused in whatever she was doing and listened, not for anything in particular, just the shape of a room adjusting itself, and the relief of spaces obeying a pattern that did not need anyone to approve. Story number 4. The lighthouse on the headland had retired with ceremony and polite applause. There were speeches about heritage and grants for the museum conversion, and then the keepers left, the last lamp was boxed, and a curtain of scaffolding wrapped the tower like winter. By autumn, the lantern room's panes were cleaned, the brass polished, and the Fresnel lens no longer illuminated stood like a glass hive in the round, a precise machine stripped of duty. The sea below kept its work regardless, the long-combed lines of swell folding toward the rocks with a patience older than any diagram. Rowan took the caretaker shift because someone needed to stay overnight while contractors kept tools in the former oil room. Rowan liked the kind of work where a building, or in this case a tower, had a fixed shape, and the hours laid themselves out around it. The headland was a good place to count steps. The path from the keeper's cottage to the tower door was 91 boards. The stair inside was cast iron, narrow and exact. The weather on the headland kept itself half a day ahead of the town. It meant the light could look like morning at a time when the houses inland were still fastened to night. The first evening alone, Rowan walked the stairs with a flashlight beam held low out of respect for the glass. The lens surrounded the lantern pedestal like a watchful presence. It smelled faintly of salt and old polish. The clockwork that had once rotated the lens weights and drums and escapement wheels had been retired into a fixed position. Brass stops kept the frame locked. A small plaque explained to future docents how the fluted prisms bent light into a signature pattern. 2 short flashes and a long every 30 seconds. The foghorn, a diaphone with a marine voice that had once struck a 2-note call, had been silent for years. The horn itself, a painted cylinder near the cliff edge, had lost its pipe to weather. The new beacon offshore did the work now, a low steel tower with a lamp that did not need ceremony. The old logbook used to live on a shelf under the lantern hatch. It had been moved to the cottage office to be scanned, leaving a pale rectangle in the dust where it had rested for decades. In its absence, Rowan kept a small notebook with times and temperatures and remarks like, "North wind, gulls lower than usual, because habits deserve places to live." On the first night, the air was clear enough to read the far boat names without binoculars. On the second, A soft sea mist formed in the last hour before dawn, the sort that makes sound press close. The thing that happened did not arrive with a shock. It slid in with the modesty of a remembered song. At exactly 3:07 by the little kitchen clock in the cottage, a faint tremor passed through the stair metal under Rowan's hand. It was not wind. Wind made a sighing note in the spiral. This had the crispness of mechanical intention, as if a gear had considered moving and then, with embarrassment at its own ambition, chosen only to be felt. Rowan set the mug on the table, stood, and listened without moving feet. The cottage had its noises, radiator clicks, the coil in the old refrigerator answering itself, but this thing existed above and separate from those. It came from the tower with a softness that did not ask for belief, only attention. Rowan took the 91 boards to the tower and unlapped the door chain. Inside, the stair held its simple geometry. The light from the flashlight touched each step in turn, 8 inches apart, precise as a metronome. At the top, the lantern room held its usual moonlight and the suggestion of the sea's breath on the panes. The lens stood still, a cathedral of glass ribs, banded prisms and bullseye panels that had once caught oil flame and flung it into certainty. Rowan put both hands on the brass guard that ringed the pedestal and felt, a hair's breadth under skin, a tiny tick. It arrived at the same interval 3 times, then stopped, like a clock, clearing its throat. On one of the prisms, barely there, a smudge of condensation traced a complete arc and then faded, as if a rotation had been imagined and lightly marked in air. The brass stops held. No movement showed. Rowan waited longer than was necessary. Simple waiting has a way of persuading whatever is restless to calm. When nothing else happened, the light was turned off and the boards counted back in the false dawn, a low pink edging along the horizon line like an old habit returning for a brief visit. The next day, the project manager stopped by with a grin that lived better in bright weather. He brought a box of informational placards in a canvas bag with neat tags and talked about the philanthropic dinner scheduled for spring. He did not ask about faint ticks that arrive at precise minutes. Rowan did not bring it up. Most things keep themselves smaller if you do not try to stretch them by narrating them too soon. The second night, mist came earlier, a gauze that the headland wore briefly before wind got under it. At 3:07, the tremor arrived not as a shiver underhand, but as a shy sound made by glass. It was a note too soft to be a chime, more like the idea of a chime, invisible fingertips brushing the edge of a perfect shape. The sound repeated twice, and then in a third tone, as if obeying a pattern that used to tell mariners where they were. The foghorn was gone. The diaphone's pipe had been capped, and the machinery removed. Yet the air near the lantern room held the memory of a call. Rowan stood with palms open and breathed deliberately, and felt the outline of a pattern pass through bone, not loud, not showy, a suggestion of old duty returning in friendliness. On the wall near the hatch, a small old stencil had been revealed by cleaning, a thin arrow pointing toward the southeast panes and the words, once white, now the color of linen, white sector keep clear. The beam of the old light had a white sector that, when it swept through a certain arc, told boats of a safe approach. Colored glass panels had blocked other arcs. The white lane had to remain open. The instruction was not for the public. It was for the keeper who might have tempted fate by hanging a jacket or a rag in the wrong place during fog. Rowan thought about that instruction and moved the museum plastic covers for the display labels so they would not sit within the arrow's arc. It was not necessary. There was no light now that could be impeded. It felt right anyway. The caretaker's radio, clipped to the belt like a habit, crackled at 3:07 on the third night with a short pulse of static that sounded like an announcement half remembered. The frequency was the local channel used by contractors and the occasional security check. The display showed channel 16 for a fraction of a second, then returned to the number it should be. Channel 16 is a distress frequency, but also the one where people greet each other and say what they're doing as they move. No voice followed. Only the breath of the sea coming up the rock, and a single gull adjusting its place in the air. A coil of rope at the lantern trap door had been set aside earlier by an electrician, the reassurance of having something practical nearby. Now, Rowan coiled it tighter, and as fingers turned, the lightest echo of an old call brushed the panes. Rowan did not say the word ghost aloud or even think it in a way that had shape. Rowan thought in the shape of maintenance. If something repeats, mark it. If it visits just once, be polite. On the fourth night, fog lay properly, a true fog with a quiet surface that made the sea seem to breathe from wider lungs. The headland wore it well. Sound carried differently, longer, gentler, a voice under blankets. At 3:07, Rowan was already on the stair, not in the way of someone hurrying, just present. The tick through brass, the soft chime through glass, the not voice on the radio, all placed themselves like notes on a staff. One more thing added itself, so steady that it felt ordinary. The faintest drafts at ankle height, running inward toward the lantern room from the doorway, as if the tower had chosen to inhale just once. A paper tag tied to a valve handle lifted and laid itself down. Rowan stayed 2 steps back from the pedestal. The white sector arrow pointed its advice at the panes. When the faint condensation traced an arc again, Rowan saw, with an intimacy that felt like permission, that the arc matched the path that would have been traced by the lens if it had turned once. Only, at that exact minute, the arc was clean. No misplaced tools or shapes intruded. The path was empty, because the old instruction had been obeyed without having been enforced by anything except courtesy. The museum conversion had planned a demonstration light, a little LED, to show visitors how the prisms move light. The electrician mentioned they would test it during the week. "We'll keep it off at night," he said lightly, because he was the sort of person who did not want to invite accidents by trying clever things at wrong hours. He did not know about 3:07. He might have found it interesting. He might have shrugged, respectfully, and changed the subject to wire gauge. A week later, a small storm wandered up the coast, not serious, not intent, the sort that sends fishermen home early without feeling scolded by the sky. The headland took a cuff of wind and low gray light. Contractors packed tools into the oil room and left by 5 with cheerful calls and a truck radio confessing old songs. Rowan made tea. The window of the cottage showed a square of fog that felt near enough to gather with hands. The kitchen clock made small decisions and settled on 3:07 again when it needed to. The tremor and the chime and the breath and the arc came as they had learned to come. Something else did too. The radio spoke in a way that was not quite a voice and yet entirely a voice. "Pon pon," it said, the careful phrase for urgency that is not disaster, for attention requested because attention could prevent trouble. The call came soft, the vowels flattened by distance, or a device no longer young. "Pon pon, small craft south of the head, visibility reduced, requesting range." The radio returned to silence, as if someone had lifted a finger off a button. Rowan did not ask who else was hearing. The offshore beacon's automation answered faintly a moment later, a different pitch, as if its speaker were new to talking. It said the expected, coordinates, weather, and encouragement to proceed with caution. The fog gave back the words inside itself and made them kind. The lighthouse tower, which had no authority and no lamp, made only its soft gestures. The tick felt in metal, the near inaudible brush along glass, the draft-like breath, the arc of condensation along the path it had once insisted upon with light. Rowan did the only thing available, stepped aside, not in fear, just in agreement with an old rule to keep the white sector clear. The flashlight went off. The coil of rope sat like a polite object against the wall. The lantern room existed as transparent space, nothing occupying the angle where an approach would be framed if approach were occurring. Far below, not loud, not movie loud, a sound arrived that could have been a hull against a small wave or someone adjusting a line with care. It did not cry for help. It asked for none. It made a syllable of relief that might have been imagined if Rowan had needed it to be. The radio said nothing else. The kitchen clock would later show 3:12, as if minutes had been ordinary. In the morning, fog lifted like a page being turned. On the rocks far down where the tide leaves kelp in particular patterns, there was a piece of white foam tied neatly with red tape, the kind builders used to mark edges during delivery. It had not been there before. It might have fallen off any old object. It might not have meant anything. Rowan carried it to the bin, and then instead, set it on a shelf by the cottage door, because there was no reason to throw out a thing that looked like a buoyant ribbon. The project manager came by and said the dinner would now be a luncheon. He had been asked to prepare a brief talk about the old signal pattern. He laughed about the phrase white sector and said it sounded like a dress code. Rowan did not correct him. Words have more than one life. The house stilled into a habit of nights. The wind traced the same note in the iron stair when it came from a certain quarter. The gulls chose different air lanes as winter approached. At 3:07, the tower kept its gentle routine. The electrician installed the small demonstration light and taped a paper sign to the switch. Do not operate at night. He did not need to add why. He liked rules that sat there not to scold, but to save everyone time. On a later night when rain arrived in small tidy bands and the fog stayed off like a well-behaved guest, Rowan Small shifted the board covering the lantern hatch. Fingerprints, dry and recent, appeared where none had been. Not a hand exactly, just the whisper of skin on clean paint. The mark faced toward the southeast panes. The arrow pointing, "White sector keep clear," looked lighter that evening, as if someone had thought about touching it and decided not to. Rowan wrote in the little notebook, because that was the contract with attention. 3:7, breathing of tower. Do not obstruct. The entry looked like a note to a future self who might forget and need reminding. On a spare rectangle of card used for price tags in the gift shop, a line was written and taped at ankle height along the base of the lantern frame, not a warning so much as a courtesy. Leave this arc open during fog. It sat there like a tiny piece of paperwork, unassuming, in a building that had once lived by paperwork. The museum opened in spring to the correct amount of eager talk. Visitors climbed the spiral in soft-soled shoes and looked at glass that made them think about navigation in a time when lamps burned and prisms lived in stories. Docents said the phrase, "White sector," with pride. The little demonstration light made 2 short flashes, and a long when someone pressed the button, and people nodded to show they had noticed what they were meant to notice. In the evenings after closing, Rowan wiped fingerprints from brass and checked for forgotten scarves and counted the boards to the cottage. Stories have a way of placing themselves into the objects people leave for later. In the gift shop, on a stand near the postcards of the lens and the gulls and the keeper's cottage in snow, someone, without drama, set a small square of thermally printed paper exactly as if it were a souvenir. The print was faded and not made by any printer currently plugged into anything in the building. It read, in soft letters, "Range clear, 3:7. No one saw who left it. No one needed to. The paper looked like something a machine might have wanted to give, and if a person had made it in a basement for a joke, it was a kind one. Sometimes, after the wind had turned and the day crew had gone, Rowan stood with hands in jacket pockets at the lantern room rail and looked at the arrow and thought of air as a kind of traffic. The tower did not aim to be mysterious. It wanted only the old courtesy. Keep the good arc clear. Step aside when the minute arrives. Do not hang anything in the wrong place when fog is present. The sea below continued its patient folding. The offshore beacon never knew it had been forgiven for not being made of brass. And when the kitchen clock showed 3:07 in a place where the refrigerator clicked and the radiator made its tick, the tower breathed in, once, and then out again, and the white sector held its invisible lane, unobstructed, generous, like a thought with enough room in it. Story number 5. The office tower kept its own weather at night. The lobby exhaled a cool, polished air that smelled faintly of stone sealer and the citrus oil the day staff liked because it made fingerprints on the glass vanish without a fuss. Outside, the city clicked and whispered in the way cities do when most windows have gone dark. Inside, the elevators idled with their doors closed, humming like instruments awaiting a hand. The directory screen by the security desk scrolled through tenant names in strict alphabetical order, small dots advancing to show what floor each company had claimed. After hours, the list felt like a roll call of people who had chosen silence. A small overnight crew kept the tower fit to be seen in the morning. Sylvia took the job because she liked walking floors that echoed gently, and because she understood routines that depended on being exact, sweep, empty, wipe, align, note. She moved from low to high, floor by floor, so as not to ride the elevator too much. Each level offered the same safe geography, glass-walled conference rooms at the corners, a break room with a careful plant that thrived on being ignored, rows of white desks with charging cords coiled like tails. The building had been new once, and had not yet had enough time to develop quirks, or so everyone assumed. The first odd thing was not dramatic. It was a word. On a Tuesday at 3:58 amperes, M, when Sylvia walked through the lobby with a cart. The directory screen scrolled past the usual insurance companies and tech firms, and paused on a listing she did not remember seeing. Mezzanine conference. M. It sat between two other names that shared nothing with it. She frowned without stopping because the tower had no mezzanine. There was a narrow slab for mechanical equipment above the 12th floor, but no one called it anything. The elevators read 1 to 24, skipping 13 inches the way buildings do when they want to keep tenants comfortable. There was no M button. The listing slid away before she had time to decide whether she cared. On the 12th floor, she pushed open the corridor door and felt a slight change in sound, like moving from a hallway into a room where someone is on a call with headphones. Not a voice, exactly. The air itself had a grain to it for a few seconds, the way air hums, when a projector has just been turned off. She stopped and checked the ceiling vents. The HVAC ticked softly, as dampers adjusted somewhere far in the building. In a conference room, a glass board glowed faintly with the residue of old marker lines no one had wiped completely clear. Across the top, in a hand that belonged to nobody in particular, were the words, "Agenda returns keys." She thought nothing of it because office life leaves lists behind the way the beach leaves foam. She wiped the board clean and watched the faint tracks of marker dissolve into the cloth, leaving the glass pristine for morning. The second odd thing arrived as a sound, almost gentle. At an hour she came to learn. At 4:11, during a slow walk down to the lobby, the elevator closest to her opened onto the empty corridor without having been called. The display above the door did not show a number. It showed a single letter. M. The car's interior was lit. The way elevators are always lit. Evenly. Forgivingly. The panel inside had buttons from 1 to 24. None was labeled M. She stood a cautious step away and watched the doors remain open for the exact number of seconds it would take a person returning to the lobby to exit with a small stack of binders. Then the doors closed with the elegant mutual courtesy of good machinery, and the car went nowhere because it had already been where it had needed to be. The display changed back to 12 and then slid to 1. Sylvia told the morning guard, who looked at the record and shrugged kindly. "Diagnostics," he said. "Sometimes an elevator will ghost a floor if there's a sensor hiccup. Our vendor will look if it repeats." He logged a brief note anyway because he believed in making notes. Under that, he drew a tiny line and wrote 4:11 twice because the time felt like a detail a person would want later. The next night, at 4:11 again, a printer in an empty tenant space on 15 woke and pushed out a page, even though the lease had not been signed and the power to the suite had been reduced to the legal minimum. Sylvia happened to be nearby, bagging shredded paper so it would not drift onto the carpet, and heard the crisp whisper of paper. The machine sat in a corner on a low table, unplugged, the sort of showpiece a real estate office borrows to make a space feel useful. The page in its tray contained a block of text aligned like a meeting agenda, dates in the left margin, and action items on the right. The items were simple and old-fashioned. Adjourn, return keys, secure minutes. In the footer, a small line that seemed like nonsense. M. Vestibule leave sign-in. She carried the page to the security desk because one does not leave printed pages lying around. The night guard was a different person, a quiet man who preferred puzzles and kept his water bottle near his elbow. He looked at the sheet and scratched handwriting at the bottom of his log where no one would see it unless they looked very close. 4:11. Paper from nowhere. Odd, but harmless. He folded the page and slid it under his keyboard. Later, when he stood to stretch, the page had moved to sit neatly by the sign-in clipboard as if it had decided it belonged near things that recorded names. On Friday morning, day staff swapped the directory for a new template. The mezzanine conference listing vanished, as if it had never been. A person who typed for a living might have deleted it, pleased with the correction, without understanding what they had changed. The elevators ran the day with their normal patience. The afternoon saw a sudden rain that made the lobby glass look like someone had leaned poems on it and let them run. By the time night returned, the building had shaken itself back into its quiet shape. Sylvia tested herself the next time the elevator opened at an empty floor with M on its display. She stepped closer, not in. She felt, unmistakably, the cool stir of conditioned air lifting out from the car, as if a set of bodies had just vacated and left their temperature behind. The interior smelled faintly of coffee that had not been drunk, and something like dry erase marker even though no one ever wrote inside an elevator. A copy of a floor evacuation plan was taped to the back panel, as required by code. In the reflection of the plan's glass, she thought no more than that she saw the suggestion of movement, the kind that happens when the brain interprets a shift in brightness as presence. She let the doors slide closed and listened to the car hum down to one with a sound she had learned before she knew she had learned it. On her day off, she told a friend over breakfast about the letter on the elevator display and the way the building seemed to recall a place that did not exist. The friend said a thing friends say when they want the world to be friendlier. It's an algorithm misfiring, or a legacy control system that still has a mezzanine indexed even though the physical floor was never built. Computers are stubborn if you don't pat them. Sylvia liked computers. She liked practical answers. She did not argue. What came after was not a haunting. It was more like a room practicing what it had been good at. The directory screen, which had been corrected, occasionally flashed a slide that looked like a reserve notice. Mezzanine rooms tonight returns then corrected itself before a human could decide whether to read it. A whiteboard on 17 would have the word minutes written at the top in a hand she did not recognize. The sign-in clipboard at the security desk acquired an extra blank sheet each night at 4 to 10. By 4:15, a line would appear at the top that was not in pen or pencil, but somehow present. Adjourned. It read like an action, not a word left by a person. The automatic shades on 10 lifted by one window width at 4 exactly, then lowered again 1 minute later, as if something needed to see the dark briefly. After a week of these small, repeatable gestures, Sylvia did something that was more a courtesy than an experiment. She printed a sign on the label printer in the janitor's room, on long white tape meant for warning bins about contents. She wrote, simply, "Leave the mezzanine vestibule clear at 4 amperes. M." It meant nothing, practically or officially. There was no mezzanine. There was no vestibule. But things do not always have to exist in order to be honored. She placed the label at ankle height on the wall opposite the elevators, a place most eyes would not find. It looked like the sort of tiny back-of-house instruction buildings accumulate over years that only people like her and the security staff ever notice. After that, 411 felt easier to occupy. The elevator revealed M and opened. She stood aside as if forming a small aisle. The air exchanged itself. The smell of coffee that couldn't be there. The holding of breath that always precedes the scrape of chairs on carpet. The way a projector warms a room by a fraction of a degree. All of it lived in that wedge of time. On some nights, the soft clink of keys in a bowl could be imagined and then dismissed as imagination. On others, the directory screen froze for a heartbeat on the word adjourned, and then moved on. Calm, uninterested in being interesting. Near the end of the month, the property manager scheduled a fire drill test with the vendor. The notice that went up for tenants said, "Alarm horns 334, 30 amperes. M, unsupervised floor by floor, no evacuation." The assurance didn't mean much to the empty. Systems would bark and flash, and the night's quiet would have to make room. The vendor arrived with 2 people, and a cart, and apologies for the hour. Sylvia kept working, changing bins as the alarms on individual floors took their turns at their assigned volume. At 4:08, the alarms paused between floors, a deliberate blank to confirm that systems reset. The corridor by the elevator on 12 went very still. The HVAC blew a soft, steady stream, as if offering calm. At 4:11, the elevator by the security desk chimed gently and opened to display M. The horn strobes did not fire during those seconds, because they had no one to impress. The printer that was not plugged in printed nothing. The directory held a polite blue, but somewhere in the building, far up in the mechanical notch above 12, a small light came on behind a frosted pane, the kind of light you cannot see directly but only as a softened insistence. The frost was glass that did not look like glass in normal days, because it was never meant to be looked at. It bore white letters backwards, from where Sylvia stood on the lobby marble. Mezzanine vestibule. They could be read because the letters were painted on the other side. The light glowed for a handful of seconds and then went out, leaving the glass not glass again. The vendor looked up without seeing the word because he did not know where to look. Sylvia saw the ghost of paint and did not say a thing. After the drill, the day security supervisor came in early with a coffee and an apology for any unrest. He found the extra sign-in page with adjourned at the top, and thought of the convenience of words appearing where they belonged. He needed to replace the clipboard soon. The clip was loose, and a paper had slipped the previous morning, landing with a faint fanfold on the desk. He pressed the stack flat and checked his log and added a short note, because it was a habit he had picked up before this building and before this job. M at 411 again. Harmless. Keep vestibule clear. Per slash, and back of house signage. He had seen the tiny label at the elevator wall and had interpreted it as a house rule he hadn't been told. He was good at learning rules without being told. In December, the tower's annual tenant winter reception filled the lobby with rented plants and warm light. People in good jackets stood where Sylvia usually rolled mop buckets and said the sorts of things people say when they are trying to keep themselves properly known to each other. A string quartet on the mezz, no, not a mezzanine. A balcony on the second floor played in a controlled, fine way. The directory screen began a loop of curated photographs of the building under snow, the tower at night, the view from 20 when fog lies under glass like a duvet. Midway through the loop, for a single frame, an image appeared that had not been scheduled. A frosted glass door with paint on it that read mezzanine rooms. Then the frame after showed banded awnings across the street, as if the camera had been pointing in two places at once, or the building had borrowed a memory. Sylvia was not at the reception. She had gone home to sleep properly and wake again at midnight. She stood at her own small kitchen counter, waiting for the kettle to realize it had reached the idea of boiling. In her building, the elevator sometimes stopped between floors with a clang that felt personal. She had learned to recognize the harmlessness of it, the way metal sometimes remembers other heat. She thought about the little label she had printed, and the way it had taken control of nothing, and had managed, in its small way, to make sense. A week later, the property manager changed the directory software to a newer build. The fonts were a little wider. The transitions stopped trying to be sleek. The listing called Mezzanine Conference did not come back. The word adjourned stopped ghosting the sign-in sheet and began to live entirely in Sylvia's notes. Nothing was over. It had simply become private. On a night when wind played with the seams of the revolving door, the elevator arrived at 12 and opened as Sylvia walked past. She stood to the side without seeing the letter but knowing it was there, because habit is faster than perception once it has settled. She thought she heard, not a voice, but the small, polite rustle of chairs being nudged back into place, the way people do when they are almost free to leave and do not want to announce their eagerness. The smell of coffee that wasn't there put a shadow on the air and then lifted. When the doors closed, the car paused as if listening for a decision and then went down. The directory stayed on its exact schedule. The building hummed like a heart at rest. Months later, a new hire at the guard desk found the old folded agenda under a keyboard and brought it to Sylvia because she was the kind of person you bring such things to. The text had faded to the color of linen. In the margin, in pencil, someone had written in neat tiny letters, "Thanks for leaving the vestibule clear." It was the sort of remark a stranger might make in a stairwell when you hold a door and step aside. Gratitude wrapped in economy. She put the page in the back of her notebook, behind lists of floors and tasks, and a sketch of the way supplies were meant to be stacked on the cart to fit through narrow corners. When she walked past the little ankle-height label at the elevator, she pressed it down with her thumb to make sure the corners still held. It was the only sign in the building addressed to a space that did not exist, and yet it was the one that felt least likely to peel. When she passed the 12th floor at 411, she kept the carpet clear and the elevator mouth untroubled, and imagined that across a pane of frosted glass, backwards letters in white paint were relieved to go on telling whoever might need to know where they were. Story number 6. The data center kept a season of its own. Outside, the industrial park sat under a sodium glow. Trucks clicked through their gears 2 streets over, and an occasional train recited its long note as it moved across the river. Inside, everything was conditional air and measured hum. Rows of racks stood in cold aisles behind clear doors, their faces lit by the steady constellation of status LEDs. Green like agreement, amber like a raised hand. Hot aisles exhaled into chimneys that fed the crack units, which answered in currents that felt like a hidden tide. Under the raised floor, a grid of tiles hid cable trays and air, the pressure of it invisible but always present. The whole place sounded like electricity thinking. Lena took the overnight operations shift because she loved work that came with a map. She liked walking each room in a specific order, scanning for lights that had decided to change their minds, listening to the way fans held a tone, and then drifted back to it after a brief rest. She liked the way the building wasn't guessing at what it was for. It kept servers alive, and that was as candid a mission as any. Her checklist lived on a rugged tablet clipped to her belt, a rotation of A hall, B hall, the mechanical yard with its sleeping chillers, battery room, generators, storage, and back. She signed the analog logbook too, because paper steadies a person. Someone before her had written their initials for every night, stretching back longer than the ink on the page remembered. The first odd thing came at 2:17 inches the morning, a minute that didn't yet belong to anything. A small click echoed in cold aisle 6, the polite sound of a handle deciding to unlatch itself. Lena was on B hall's far end, counting the double blink on a top of rack switch that had a way of asking for attention without actually needing it. Her radio, clipped to her shoulder, made a single static syllable and then was quiet. On the DCIM screen in the control nook, a notification she did not recognize appeared, and then hid itself, like a child behind furniture peeking out of Reflex Legacy Interconnect Handshake, it said, and was gone. The doorway to Cold 6 showed closed on the sensors. The floor plan's overlay told a different story for just long enough for her to feel it. She walked the long way on purpose, past the storage cage where extra rails leaned like letters that never got sent, down the side aisle where her footsteps found the same 3 floor tiles that had a slightly different sound from the rest. She didn't hurry. Inside the cold aisle, the air had that bright chill that makes skin think it belongs to liquid. The clear sliding door at the far end was a centimeter open, though the latch read shut. On the other side, the hot aisle breathed its warm breath toward the ceiling without caring who watched. A strip of paper someone had taped to a patch panel months ago. Port map. Do not remove, lifted and laid itself down. It would have been easy to write it off as a vacuum difference, or a rack door not quite sealed. The crack unit on the wall exhaled a steady 46% humidity and looked forward to never being thanked for it. Lena touched the edge of the door, felt the harmless cool of the plastic, and slid it until the latch found the familiar click. The sound, for such a small thing, rang along the aisle like a marble run under skin, and then took its place among the building's ordinary notes. In the morning, she wrote it in the log. 2:17. Cold 6 door soft. She wasn't superstitious about time. She was careful about patterns. The second night, the time obliged her note. At 2:17 precisely, the label printer in the control nook woke by itself. It was the kind used for patch cord flags and storage bins, a quiet rectangle that had nothing to do unless a hand gave it a job. It whispered a length of tape from its mouth, cut it, and let it fall with ceremony to the table. In tiny block letters, black on white, the machine presented a conclusion. H4 handshake. Lena blinked at the strip. H4 was a designation that belonged to the cages on the north wall, back when the space had been first fitted out with shared cabinets and hand-signed agreements. That area had been consolidated. The designation still lived in the inventory database like a closed door in a floor plan. She pressed the tape to the logbook's margin because paper likes living with other paper. She opened DCIM and trawled the event history. In the river of entries that read like the liturgy of a patient temple temperature thresholds, filter alarms, power strips reporting their amps, there it was, sitting like a sentence from an old dialect. Vier Pier, requesting route. 217, no action required. Acknowledge? The button did nothing when she pressed it, as if the request had never been meant for a finger. The old floor plans were in a flat file beneath the control nook counter. Drawn before cloud was a word that could be applied to racks. Lena pulled one out because drawings matter even when they're not the same as whatever is over your head. On the blueprint, Cold 6 and its neighbors lay like clean teeth. A yellow pencil line drawn by some long-gone hand traced a route from the main entrance through a then-open cable trough to cage H4. In the margin, a note. Keep path clear midnight. 0200 for cutovers. Keyboard writing covered it later, but the pencil line remained. Patient. The third night, the radios for the chillers out in the yard pinged each other in their own small language, and Lena went out with a jacket zipped up to her throat because mechanical nights carries a pure kind of cold even on a mild evening. The chillers sat like quiet ships, white paint dull in the light. Beyond the fence, The river muttered happily to itself. At 2:17, the floodlights along the side of the building did not change. No gate moved. But in a hall, back inside, the smart PDUs on the left-hand racks lit their bar graph LEDs in sequence in a way Lena had never seen. Not a warning pattern red, not amber, just a passing wave of green from one end to the other, the way people do a ripple with their hands in a crowd. It moved along cold 6 and then died away. No load spiked. No servers noticed enough to put numbers to it. The ripple felt like acknowledgement, and maybe that was all it had been. She began keeping the aisle cleaner than clean at that hour. Crash carts didn't live there anyway policy, but sometimes someone would leave a coil of cable high on a door brace, and sometimes a spare box of cage nuts would squat where no box should. At 1:50, she walked the length, slid a foot under the small things that collect in a place made of edges, and rolled them out. It was easier to make a path when she believed that the path mattered. At 2:17 the next night, the KVM for row 3, which was attached to nothing and everything and had 2 monitors that memorialized screensavers from the year glasses looked smaller, woke and displayed a login prompt for a system that had never lived here in her tenure. Exchange trunk maintenance. The prompt did not invite a password from her hands. It did what old systems do when they are replaying themselves. The cursor blinked 3 times, and then vanished. The screen went to black. She lifted her hands from the keyboard, though she had not realized they had drifted toward it, and put them in her pockets like a person waiting to cross a street. The building did not ask anything from her in words. It asked in behavior. Do not block the good lane. Let the minute happen. When she finished the shift, she made a label out of private kindness and stuck it inside the cold aisle door at knee height, where only those who knew where to glance would ever see it. Cold 6, no staging 1. 52:30. The label sat like a neighborly rule that had always been there, and within a week other people had adjusted to it without asking why. On Tuesday, the network engineer who came in early on his bike rolled to the control nook and leaned on the counter with the easy affection of someone who loved the building in a different way. Lena showed him the H4 entry in the DCIM history and expected him to laugh. He did not. He made a face like a person chewing a difficult piece of fruit and then nodded. Back when this room was a different kind of room, he said, we had a tie to the old switch office across town, legacy to legacy, just to keep hands on it until everyone agreed to stop. There was a maintenance route right through here. I think it ran at night mostly. Weird that any of that naming would still be anywhere. Those systems aren't here. He shouldered his pack and left her with his sentence. He came back later with a donut from the bodega and did not bring the subject up again except to say, thanks for the path label. It makes sense even if I don't know why. Weeks in, the building offered what it had, the way a musician with only one instrument stretches what a song can do within those strings. At 2:17, the rack door's latches made their dry little sounds in a line, checking themselves very softly. The crack units adjusted dampers together and then returned them. The current draw on the north bus bar dipped by a hair, rose by the same hair, and slid onto its old baseline. The cabinet keys hanging in the storage cage gave each other a single discrete bump. The effect wasn't a trick or a show. It was like a room asking itself if it remembered how to be a room during a particular task, and then relaxing at the answer. A storm came through in a slow, obliging way that weather sometimes has when it isn't in the mood to punish. The generators idled in their room for 2 minutes in an exercise, then coughed into useful work. UPS banks shouldered their share without comment. Lena sat in the control nook and watched the grid of indicators change from green with grid to green on Gen in polite squares. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw the H4 tag on the logbook's margin, as if the strip of tape had decided it was an I. At 2:17, amid real transfer, the small legacy thing happened with no more urgency than usual, as if the building could carry 2 songs at once at different volumes. The courteously unlatching click of Cold 6's far door came and went in its neat second. A label fluttered and settled. The building took a breath and let it out. Lena put her hand on the edge of the console. And let that be agreement. The plant manager, who saw the world as a set of valves that should be opened only once, had a way of eating his sandwich that made napkins nervous. One night on his rounds, he found the old floor plans open on the counter and pointed with a finger he'd cut on some sharp reality days before. They forgot to remove everything once upon a time, he said. Sometimes forgetting to remove is what saves things. He didn't elaborate. He checked a list and left his coffee on the wrong shelf where the cup would never be knocked and never be noticed by anyone but Lena, who moved it to a better wrong place. On a night so clear that the world looked like its own reflection, the access control server rebooted for its scheduled patch right on time. The readers on the doors blinked to that deep blue. That means wait. At 2 to 17 during that window, the little request still placed itself into the air. The badge readers didn't see it, because they weren't seeing anything. The cold aisle door slid a hair and stopped itself and went back. Not a ghost opening a door, just a system insisting on the idea of making a lane and then accepting the building's gentler rules. And through the servers, across logs that had no business outliving their decisions, a line fell like snow and landed without melting. Legacy Pier. Acknowledged. Route. Clear. She found it later, not where a sensible log would keep it, but printed, without request, from the label maker that had started the conversation weeks ago. The tape said, smaller even than before, "Thank you for no staging." Lena could have ripped it up. She peeled the backing and put it on the inside of the cabinet with the patch cords labeled House, because private gratitude looks well in a private place. The only time the building went sharp about it was the night an outside contractor, new to the room and used to staging inefficient lines, left a pallet's worth of empty shipping cartons in the cross aisle that cut toward cold 6. It was the sort of human oversight that happens when the world is habit and a clock is just a circle. Lena found them at 1:55 and sent a message in the chat that nobody saw because nobody needed to see it until morning. She rolled the pallet jack back with care, nested the boxes, and tucked them under an empty work table like a paper fort. She stood in the path and watched the minute arrive, and it did, and it tilted like a bird's wing and then leveled. Later, on a lunch in the break room where the vending machine light makes things look colder than they are, the network engineer told her an old story in pieces, the way people tell things that they're not sure belong to them. Switch office used to have a night tech who walked a regular route, he said. He'd call in to say the path was clear. Nobody thought about path except when they did. The lines would try to make a change at odd hours, so no one noticed hiccups. Might be nothing. Might be a memory. Migrations have personalities sometimes. He smiled like he knew it was a ridiculous sentence that still rested true in the ear. You're doing what the old poster used to say, actually. Keep clear, keep current, keep quiet. I think those were the words. It was a safety thing, but it fits other things. Spring found the river hurrying past the building like it had a train to catch. The poplars beyond the fence put out that bright, uncertain green they wear for only a week. Lena began to write a small line into the runbook, because documents are also places to put relief. Cold 6. Maintain centerline open 2:30. Historical request persists. No action required. It would look odd to anyone new. It would look like a joke. It would be read by the kind of person who reads runbooks looking for corners to steady with a thumb. It might make the rest of the steps easier to take because understanding even a single unnecessary seeming rule primes the brain to trust all the necessary ones that come after. One night, the security camera that stared down the cold aisle in useful, boring grayscale lifted its exposure for a breath at 2:17 and then returned it. If a person called up that frame and cued it forward and backward, they might say the light moving was a reflection of something off screen. If they didn't need to name anything, they might say it was a shape like a route finding itself, the narrow idea of traffic held in brightness with nothing in it, relieved of obstruction. The servers did their math. The storage wrote its blocks. The alarm panel sat with its lights arranged like stars. Months later, the facility handed some racks to another site, because that's what the world had decided it needed. Lena took a job at a different building that made different noises. On her last night, she walked cold 6 and put her palm against the clear door. The plastic transmitted cold and the tiny tick under it that she had learned to recognize. At 2:17, the label printer did not spit tape. The PDUs did not ripple. The unlatching click made its small, full sound. She had nothing to add. That was the point. Weeks after she left, a plain envelope rode in the mail at her new job, a forwarded stack of paperwork from her last week. At the bottom, an extra slip curled with age or just the way paper curls when it has been warm against a machine. It was a thermal strip, not a label. Different mouth, different printer. The text barely held itself in order. H4 route recognized, path clear. There was no return address. It wasn't the sort of thing any department would write. She put it inside a notebook not because she believed it would fade, but because it was good to give a place to a sentence that had done its work and then asked for nothing. At her new building, where the fans sang in a new pitch and the floor tiles sounded different, she added quietly to a brand new run book in a section called House Rules, leave the path clear at the hour the room prefers. People laughed. People learned. And in the room she had left, somewhere behind a clear door, a small friendly click kept its minute and then gave it back. Story number 7. The city keeps a planetarium inside a low-brick science center with a dome like a quiet half-moon. At night, the building looks asleep, except for the faint sapphire lane lights that trace the ramp up to the dome's door. The parking lot sighs with the sound of the highway blocks away. A fountain has been turned off for winter, and its shallow basin holds a little clean rain like a dark lens. Inside, the auditorium spreads under a gray hemisphere with soft seats that all look toward the center, where the star machine stands like an instrument waiting to be tuned. It is a latticework of arms and lenses, a mechanical planet with tiny windows that cast maps of light when told to. It has a name stenciled near the base that was picked long ago and has outlived most of its operators. Naveen took the overnight maintenance rotation because the planetarium is kind at night. The only light comes from the foot lamps at the stairs and the small LEDs on the control console. The room has the particular sound that domes have, a hush backed by a slow breath from the ventilation system, the kind of breath that makes people whisper even when they are alone. His tasks are measured. He cleans lens caps with a cloth that feels like paper but isn't. He checks the alignments against a grid program that throws a faint web across the dome. He runs a calibration that moves the machine through motions it learned when maps were drawn by hand. He writes times neatly in a log that lives in a drawer made of wood older than the building. On his first weekend, the schedule is empty after the last public show ends. The staff lock the lobby doors and switch off the exhibit cases with their lightning balls and pinball planets and brass gyros you can spin with 2 fingers. The only people in the building are Naveen and a security guard who prefers to walk the science wing where the dinosaur skeleton stands, dignified as if no one had ever called it a skeleton. Naveen enjoys the quiet in the dome. The light on the console that means the projectors are at rest glows like a single star in a convenience store sky. The oddness is not introduced by a sound. It is introduced by a moment. At 1:41 by the console clock, because that time is printed in tiny numbers at the top right corner of every control screen. The go button on the show controller lights. As if someone has triggered a cue, the star machine is idle. The auto shutter is closed. The show software sits at a blank grid. Still, the little square button glows its persuasive green. Naveen checks the scheduler. The page that would list any event is empty. He looks at the file manager that holds narrated shows with names like Winter Tonight and Origins. Nothing is open. In the hush, a recorded chime of the sort that suggests people take their seats plays once at very low volume from somewhere not obvious. It is not the one they use now. It is an older tone, softer, with a bit of tape inside it, as if it learned its shape on a different machine. The blue aisle lights along the stairs raise themselves by a few degrees, the way house lights lift right before a show so people can settle without stumbling. It is not dramatic, it is considerate. Naveen looks up at the empty dome, its surface blank and cool as a winter pond. He does not press the go button, because pushing buttons when you don't understand them is how nights become longer than they need to be. He dims the footlights back to their comfort level. The button's glow goes out by itself after a minute. He writes in the log 1:41, pre-show tone, because a note is a kind of friendship with the next person. The next night, the minute appears again the way a place can appear around a bend. The building has learned to sleep in cold weather. The heaters and air handlers swap duties with a small clack of baffles. It is 1:40 when the console clock ticks its square digits in a way that reminds him of train boards in old movies. The dome is in calibration mode, a faint grid spun across it, a net you can walk through without touching. He has the alignment almost perfect when the grid receives, for the length of a held breath, 1,000 points that do not come from his machine. It looks like dust, finally deciding it is time to be stars. The machine is quiet. Its lamp is off. The faint points do not illuminate the room. They sit on the surface like a thought settling. then they are gone. The go button makes its small polite light again, and then gives up. He checks the shutters, the access door to the catwalk, the dimmer rack. Everything sits where it should, clipped in and clean. He stands in the main aisle and lets the dome be above him without asking anything of him. The faintest draft runs up the center of the room, the sort that happens when you open a door in a different part of a building and air makes a small private adjustment. He hears the dry click of a single seat, as if someone had shifted their weight in the third row. He says nothing aloud. He does not need to. The daytime staff have a humor they share about the so-called ghost light theaters leave on stage when everyone goes home. A planetarium does not leave a light for safety the same way. It leaves darkness. Even so, the old showrunner who trained him insisted on habit. "Leave a trace of light on the steps," she had said. "Just a trace. The room likes a little company at night." Naveen finds himself respecting that instruction the way a person respects a knitted blanket on a couch they didn't knit. After a week of the 141 glow appearing and disappearing without harm, curiosity, polite and quiet, arrives and sits beside him. He goes into the catwalk that circles the lower edge of the dome, the cove, where projectors for individual constellations used to live before the system went digital. The catwalk smells faintly of dust, and a cleaner that had lived in the carpet for a generation. There are boxes up there that no one touches anymore, because no one wants to throw away things that once were important. He finds a tray of old metal slides, heavy in the way precise things are heavy. Each frame holds a tiny drawing on glass, lines connecting stars in styles that change with decades. Orion with a longer belt, Cassiopeia with a curve. Each slide is labeled in clean hand script that has outlived the person who wrote it. He notices that one slide is missing from a set called Winter Sky 17, and that the box it should rest in holds instead a folded card that says, "Cue on caution at pre-show." He does not move anything. He puts the lid back as if it were a letter returned to the right envelope. On the night it rains, the dome amplifies the sound until it sounds like weather on an alien world. The beams that support the skin creak gently with temperature. The lobby signs have been set to their nighttime messages. "Thank you for visiting. See you soon under the stars." And the shop with its pinwheels and meteor fridge magnets is dark. Naveen brings tea in a thermos and sits at the console and watches numbers count themselves up and down. At 141, the software he is not running moves from a blank page to a scene template. It is a slide he recognizes from a program they retired 2 directors ago. A welcome that reminds people to keep aisles clear and to hold questions for later. The words arrive without the picture. A voice that is not the current narrator speaks them. The voice is careful and gentle and a little amused. The way a person who has explained something 1,000 times can still make the 1,001st feel newly made. Then it stops. The console returns to its blank, patient blue. Naveen places his hands on the edge of the control surface and feels, faintly, the vibration of the air machines 3 rooms away. He rises and checks the steps that lead down to the center, not because anything seems out of place, but because moving is another way of being respectful. On row C, seat 22, a seat with a view that makes the center feel far enough away to be safe, he sees a faint scuff not made by anyone that day. He brushes it away with his sleeve and thinks of nothing in particular. People who work in domed rooms keep time differently. Dawn is not when the sky lightens. It is when a certain staff switch clicks and makes the dome white as a wall so someone can balance a projector's colors. Midnight is when the building systems decide to do their updates. The planetarium has its own minute now. He writes it in the log in small, neat letters. 1:40. 1 courtesy cue. It is the only line of the night that speaks to something with no ticket. The senior technician comes in to swap a lens on a Wednesday. She is a practical person with the careful movements of someone used to carrying glass past door jams. When he mentions the minute, she nods once and offers a story in the gate of the door, not wanting to expand it into a ghost tale because she dislikes drama. Years ago, the planetarium held midnight meteor programs when a shower was predicted to be bright. People would come with blankets and sit slightly too still. At some point, the director began a tradition of a silent minute before the show to help everyone settle, and the lights would stay just bright enough to keep the center aisle empty. It became a habit. Then the show moved earlier, then later, then away altogether. Sometimes rooms keep the shape of the last thing that felt important in them, she says. and moves on to the gentle work of focusing a lens with a half-turn. Naveen smiles because he likes believing in the memory of rooms. He prints a small notice for the inside of the control booth, where only staff see it. No seating or cases in center aisle between 135 and 150. It reads like a safety policy, which is the best way to hide a courtesy. The night guard sees it during a boredom loop and nods as if to say, of course, we leave room for what wants to pass. A month turns. Outside, the clouds decide what kind of winter it will be. Inside, the projector completing its nightly test stops with Polaris, a hair to the left of the dome's true center, and then corrects itself with a soft sound like the edge of a page being turned. At 141, the old voice from an older show gently says the single word, welcome, as if to the idea of people rather than their bodies. The aisle lights make their fraction of a step rise. The air makes a soft lane in the room. From the catwalk, something like a pointer crosses the dome. So faint that he thinks at first it must be a trick of his eyes, a red bead the size of a mistake, tracing the path the ecliptic would take if the lamp were on. It pauses where people once looked for Jupiter in November, and then continues. The star spheres inside the machine do not move. His hands never touch the control. The pointer finishes its travel and fades where the horizon would be. He does not follow it with his eyes. He lets it be. On a later night, he tries sitting in the back row during the minute to see whether the dome says anything different if you are not at the console behaving like a person who believes in switches. The seats breathe faintly when someone shifts, and one of them does, gently, near the aisle at D22. He could imagine the warmth left by a coat. The old voice says nothing that night. The minute is just a minute in which the dome holds the sense of having been used. Then the room goes back to being an empty room with a machine that can map stars with better accuracy than anyone used to dream. He develops a hypothesis that is less mystical than it feels. It is that the room has a working hour of its own, and that if it is allowed that, it will not misbehave the rest of the time. Rooms, like people, like permission. He never leaves cases or carts in the center when he can help it. He makes sure the little rubber tip on the pointing wand that docents sometimes use is set back in its stand rather than leaning against the dome. He aligns the grid and never leaves it on during the minute because it feels like drawing a pattern over someone else's hand. The museum director arranges an overnight live stream for a meteor shower. No one is sure will deliver. The public does not attend. The program is for people at home. He sits at the console with a camera pointed up at the dome to catch the artificial stars while, outside, the real ones have their say. The feed is quiet and clean. Comments slide by with the dignity of good chat moderation. At 1:41, the go button lights its small welcome for the camera and the room. He does not touch it. The old tone plays, barely caught by the microphone. People watching type little strings of characters that look like palm of the hand applause. He lets the minute pass and then resumes the script in a low voice, showing people how to follow a constellation from one star to the next with the suggestion of a fingertip. No one mentions the minute in the morning meeting. He does not bring it up. The only time anything approaches sharpness is one night when a touring laser show leaves its crates in the wrong place to be loaded out in the morning. The crates rest along the center, padded and heavy in a way that makes air think of walls. Naveen finds them at 1:30. There is no one to call. He pops the brakes and nudges each until they are tight to the side. The room breathes more happily, with the line open again. When the minute arrives, the dome's surfaces return to being a place for light rather than obstacles. The old tone comes and goes, with expectation fulfilled. The next day, he prints a number where a performer will see it and writes beside it in a friendly hand, "Keep this lane empty overnight. Thanks." The touring crew do not roll their eyes. They have their own superstitions. The planetarium renovates one spring feature and replaces a small monorail speaker behind a cove panel with a newer one. While doing so, someone finds a tape label adhered to the inside in brittle paper that says, "Meteor Minute in handwriting, neat enough to be from when handwriting was part of the job." The label is left there, a little museum for people who will never be audience. In the same week, a retired director sends a postcard from a city with a different dome, writing in careful block letters that the tradition of a quiet minute is portable if you treat it as courtesy and not as magic. Naveen puts the card behind a frame on the office corkboard and smiles each time he sees it. The oddest gift arrives without noise. On a night when the ventilation has a different note because somewhere else in the building a door has been left propped, he returns from the catwalk to find a small rectangle of plastic on the console tray. It is a slide, a real one, old, with a black mask and a tiny, perfect diagram on it, 2 lines crossing, labeled with the names of stars in a style that went out of use decades ago. On the edge, a number, 17. He lifts it with 2 fingers the way people lift small birds. It must have fallen from a tray he had not touched that night. It does not matter how the slide got there. He holds it up, not to the projectors, but to the faint blue light of the console. The tiny drawing is a pointer to a place where, on winter nights, people once looked together and voiced the word they felt without making a sound. He returns it to its box in the cove. He closes the lid with the careful quiet of someone laying down a book at the end of a day. He writes in the log, 140. 1. All good. The entry is simple. It will mean only something to someone who also spent their nights watching small lights do their jobs. The minute keeps coming. It arrives in the heart of summer when the dome air is a fraction cooler than the lobby. It arrives in early autumn when children's voices still bounce off the walls hours after they have left. The way rooms keep energy a while. It asks for nothing. It gives a sense that something has been used correctly. Naveen ages, barely, into someone who understands that attention is its own reward. He keeps the aisle empty. He lets the pre-show chime happen. He does not hunt for a source. On his last shift before he moves to a different job across town, he comes to the dome without a list. The console recognizes him and offers the same polite readiness it always has. He sits in the back row this time, the way a person sits in a church when they are not praying. The dome is blank and perfect. The control booth glows behind him. The machine stands in its posture of permanent intention. At 1:41, the minute happens for him like it has happened for the room. Unadorned and full. The lights along the aisle warm up a degree. The air runs its small river up the center. The chime whispers the shape of taking your seat. Somewhere near D22, a seat nudges its own hinge and then is still. The old voice holds a breath as if preparing to speak, and then decides everyone already knows what they need. He stays until the minute is over. Then he stands and goes down to the console and switches the dome to white, because the dawn crew will appreciate arriving to a morning sky. In the break room, he leaves a note in the front of the log for whoever is handed the keys next. It does not mention times or lights or voices. It says only this: when the room wants to be itself, it will tell you. Give it that, and it will be kind the rest of the night.